The dust hung low that afternoon in Luzon, 1945. A convoy of U.S. military trucks rolled into the captured compound, canvas flapping, engines coughing under the tropical heat. Japanese prisoners, women, medics, clerks stood shoulder to shoulder under the harsh sun. Then came the order that made time stop. An American MP stepped forward, holding a length of coarse hemp rope, frayed and sweat, stained from use. His words cut through the humidity. "Wear this rope on your neck." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The women's faces tightened, confusion mixing with fear. To them, rope meant shame, execution, or both. The Americans meant identification, not humiliation, but that meaning was lost in the heat and dust. The rope looked too much like the thing used to bind or hang. One of the prisoners, her uniform still bearing the Red Cross armband, whispered, "Is this our punishment?" Her voice broke like dry bamboo. The MP, barely 20, avoided their eyes. He'd been briefed, all POW. You must display rope. Bound tags with prisoner numbers. Geneva Convention, standard regulation. But standing in front of women who had never imagined surrender, the order felt like something else. Behind him, another guard uncoiled more lengths, dozens of them, each rope looped neatly, prepared for every neck. Reports indicate over 300,000 Japanese POW were held by Allied forces during the war, but fewer than 1% were women. Most of those captured had served as nurses, clerks, or auxiliaries. For them, captivity was not just defeat, it was dishonor. An American officer balked again, slower this time. "Wear it now." The first woman stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she lifted the rough cord. When it touched her skin, she flinched, as if burned. The rope fibers scraped her collarbone, heavy with salt and dust. Around her, others followed in silence, one by one, until the camp shimmered with lines of hemp against pale necks. Some guards looked away. One soldier muttered, "It's just a rule." But the women didn't hear the rule, they only felt the rope. And as the final knot tightened, the heat seemed to thicken around them. No one yet knew that this rope, meant as identification, would become a symbol of something far deeper. The question whispered through the ranks. What did they mean by rule? The next morning, the same sun burned hotter, bleaching everything pale. The ropes had left faint red rings around the women's necks, marks that looked too much like bruises. When the American guards gathered them again, the air buzzed with unspoken dread. One of the MP, Sergeant Miller, raised both hands, trying to calm the tension. "Listen," he said, his voice cracking through a cheap megaphone. "It's not punishment, it's procedure." But the words fell through translation like sand through fingers. The Japanese women only caught fragments: punishment, neck, rule. Their eyes stayed on the rope, not the speaker. The nice interpreter had not yet arrived, so the message twisted in the space between languages. To the guards, this was a bureaucratic necessity. To the women, it was ritual humiliation, a leash tied to defeat. Miller tried again. He pointed at his own chest, tapping an imaginary tag. Identification, prisoner of war, safety, but no amount of English gestures could soften the sting. In Japanese, the idea of wearing something around the neck evoked execution or disgrace. The women stood still, eyes lowered. According to Allied protocols, every POW had to wear a visible identification mark, either a tag or cord, as per the Geneva Convention of 1929. The rope wasn't an insult. It was logistics. But the Japanese military never trained its personnel for surrender. They were conditioned to die, not to comply. A nurse whispered to the woman beside her, "They call it safety. We hear shame." Another muttered, "Better a bullet than this." The guards didn't understand, but they could feel the defiance in those voices. By noon, the camp routine resumed rice rations, water checks, sanitation lines. Yet the ropes remained tight. Each knot carried a different emotion: confusion, rage, resignation. Miller leaned against a fence post, wiping sweat from his brow. "They think we're mocking them," he said quietly to another guard. "We're just following rules. But in war, rules often sound like orders, and orders can sound like cruelty." The sound of the rope brushing against cloth became the new heartbeat of the camp. Quiet, constant, misunderstood. One woman tugged at her cord, trying to loosen it, then stopped. Her hand trembled, but not from fear. It was memory stirring, the memory of who she'd been before this order. Tomorrow her story would surface. Her name was Akiko. Before the rope, before the camp, Akiko had been a Navy nurse stationed in Manila, one of the last Japanese medical units on the retreat. Her world had once been sterile white sheets, tin basins, and the smell of disinfectant. Then came the air raid. The morning sky cracked open with the scream of engines, and the hospital roof disintegrated under American bombs. The wounded screamed, blood ran down tiled corridors. Akiko remembered grabbing her kit and shouting for others to crawl toward the mangled doorway. She had treated American soldiers before the war. Now she was patching up her own. Men too far gone to save. When the field hospital collapsed, she and a handful of survivors fled into the jungle. For days they stumbled barefoot through mud, carrying what little they could. Morphine vials, a rusted scalpel, a prayer book. Hunger hollowed them. One by one, the group was caught. When American troops surrounded their clearing, Akiko didn't raise her hands, she froze. Surrender was not a word she'd ever been taught. Her commanding officer had said it clearly: no one returns alive. Yet there she was, hands shaking, rope waiting. Out of an estimated 20,000 Japanese nurses who served overseas, reports suggest fewer than 200 were captured alive. Akiko was one of them. Her capture didn't feel like survival, it felt like betrayal. In her head, she could still hear the air raid sirens. When the MP told her to wear the rope, her mind went back to Manila. The sound of the rope fibers scraping her skin reminded her of bandage gauze against burned flesh. She thought of her patients, how they'd looked at her with pleading eyes. Now she was the one being tended to, fed, ordered. That night, as the camp lights flickered out, Akiko traced the rough cord at her throat. She whispered something to herself, not in prayer, but in disbelief. "I once treated their wounded," she murmured. "Now they bind my neck." The wind picked up through the barracks, rattling tin sheets like the echo of distant planes. Akiko turned toward the bamboo fence, eyes reflecting a sliver of moonlight. Beyond that fence, somewhere, lay the remnants of her old hospital, and the next day, the camp itself would show her a different kind of battlefield. When the trucks finally stopped, the women saw their new world, a crude cluster of bamboo huts ringed with barbed wire. The camp sprawled across a dry rice field in central Luzon, its fences sagging under heat and humidity. The air smelled of mud, sweat, and kerosene. American guards called it temporary housing. To the women, it looked like a cage made of grass and wire. Each hut baked under the tropical sun. The walls were thin bamboo slats, letting in light, insects, and every sound from the guards' radios outside. Inside, the women slept on straw mats laid over packed dirt. A few makeshift shelves held tin bowls and water flasks. Every morning began with a whistle roll call ration line inspection. The sound echoed through the camp like a factory shift bell. Reports indicate that temperatures in Luzon reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit that summer. The camp held roughly 400 prisoners, 12 of them women. There was no real medical tent, only a corner shaded by tarpaulin where Akiko sometimes tended to the sick. She cleaned wounds with boiled rainwater, wrapping them with torn scraps of uniform. For the first few days, fear ruled. Every shout from a guard made the women flinch, but the cruelty they expected never came. Instead, the Americans handed out soap bars, toothbrushes, even sanitary cloth. The shock was physical. These same women had seen comrades beaten by their own officers for far less mercy. One evening, a young MP approached with a clipboard, offering clean water. Akiko hesitated before accepting the metal cup. The guard nodded once and walked off without a word. That small act cracked something inside her, a confusion she couldn't name. In her training, the enemy was faceless. Here, the enemy offered water. When night fell, the barracks glowed dimly with lantern light. The women whispered quietly, afraid to be overheard. They spoke of the soap, the rations, the way the guards avoided eye contact. "Maybe they pity us," one said. Another replied, "Maybe it's a trick." Akiko said nothing. She only watched the rope tags glint under the lantern, fragile, ordinary, yet somehow defining them all. Outside, a guard's voice echoed across the compound. "Lights out, ladies." The word ladies lingered in the humid air, alien and disarming. And as the soap lather dripped from Akiko's hands into the dirt, a thought rose. Maybe captivity wasn't what she'd been taught to fear. By the end of that week, the routines in the bamboo camp had hardened into something eerily domestic. The same whistle blew at dawn, the same rice portions scooped into metal tins, and the same American MP shouted roll call. But something new had crept in, disbelief. Each morning, the women were handed sanitary kits, brushes, and meals containing small slices of meat. They stared at the food before touching it, half expecting it to be a test. Akiko watched the steam rise from her bowl, white rice, boiled vegetables, a piece of canned beef. Back in the Philippines campaign, her entire surgical team had shared one rice ball a day. Now she was being served like an honored guest by the men she had once called devils. One guard, trying to make conversation, pointed at the beef and said, 3,000 calories, keeps you strong. The interpreter repeated the words awkwardly in Japanese. The women looked at each other, stunned. Back home, soldiers at the front were lucky to get 1,200 calories, often moldy rice, mixed with weeds. Here, inside barbed wire, prisoners ate better than free citizens of the empire. Whispers rippled through the barracks that night. "They are feeding us more than our officers ever did," someone said. Another replied, "They want to fatten us before the trial." But Akiko noticed something different in the guards' faces, exhaustion, not malice. Most were barely older than she was, sweating in their helmets, trying to follow a rulebook none of them truly understood. When soap and clean clothes arrived next, the tension broke into quiet laughter. The women tried washing in buckets, the unfamiliar scent of American detergent filling the air. For the first time, they caught their reflections in the water, faces thinner but alive. It was a cultural collision that neither side could explain. The Japanese had been raised to see surrender as spiritual suicide. The Americans saw humane treatment as proof of civilization. Somewhere between those two beliefs stood Akiko, rope around her neck, soap in her hand, and a mind unraveling everything she thought she knew. As the sun dipped below the barbed wire horizon, a guard walked by, muttering broken Japanese. No fear, clean, good. The words sounded kind, but something in his tone was off. The women froze, unsure whether to smile or obey. Tomorrow that misunderstanding would explode. The next morning cracked open with tension. Clouds were thick and low, pressing heat into the camp like a lid on boiling water. The women stood in line, ropes around their necks, waiting for inspection. Sergeant Miller's voice echoed across the yard, sharp, clipped, hurried. "Rope check," he yelled, tapping his clipboard. The Japanese prisoners froze. The phrase hit them like gunfire. To the guards, rope check meant a quick roll call, making sure no one had removed their identification cords. But to women who had grown up hearing soldiers bark, "Prepare the rope," before executions, it sounded like a death sentence. One woman dropped her tin bowl, another covered her face. Akiko's pulse surged so fast she could hear it in her ears. The air turned electric with panic. A single mistranslated word had become terror made flesh. Reports show that roughly 70% of American camp guards during the Pacific occupation had no formal interpreter training. Orders were shouted in English, guessed in broken gestures, and misread in fear. This was one of those moments. A few guards exchanged confused looks as murmurs rippled through the line. "What's wrong with them?" one whispered. Miller frowned. "They don't get it. Just check the damn ropes." He stepped forward, tugging gently at a tag hanging from Akiko's cord to inspect it. The touch made her flinch backward so violently that two women cried out. For a heartbeat, everyone reached for their weapons. Then silence. Akiko's breathing came in short, shaking bursts. The guard stared at her, lost, realizing he'd triggered something he couldn't name. "Easy," he said softly, lowering his hands, but the word meant nothing in that language. Fear had already turned the air heavy. The standoff lasted seconds, but felt like forever, until a jeep roared up from the gate. Dust spiraled around its tires as an interpreter jumped out, waving his cap. "Stop," he shouted in both languages. "Misunderstanding. Rope check means count, not kill." Relief rippled like a wave through the line, but it left behind exhaustion, the kind that doesn't leave your bones. Akiko stood motionless, rope tag trembling against her collarbone. The interpreter turned toward her group, breathing hard, about to translate everything they'd misunderstood. The interpreter's arrival sliced through the panic like a clean blade. He was young, barely 25, wearing a U.S. Army uniform but carrying a Japanese face. His name tag read K. Tanaka, miss. He lifted both hands, palms open, and spoke in calm, precise Japanese. "They're not here to harm you. The rope is only an identification rule." The women stared, disbelief softening into stunned silence. For the first time, someone spoke their language with authority and mercy. Tanaka was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American from California. He had joined the military intelligence service, one of nearly 6,000 Nisei soldiers who translated millions of Japanese documents and interrogated prisoners across the Pacific. His job was to build bridges across the wreckage of language. But here, inside the bamboo camp, it felt like stitching humanity back together. He turned to Sergeant Miller. They thought rope check meant execution. Miller's face went pale. Jesus, no wonder. The guard lowered his clipboard, shame flickering behind his eyes. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The interpreter's words hung in the humid air, rearranging meanings and undoing fear. Akiko took a hesitant step forward. "Then why rope?" she asked softly in Japanese. Tanaka met her gaze. "Because rules are rules." He replied, almost whispering, "Every POW, you must carry proof of capture. It's the law, not the rope, that binds you." That sentence landed heavier than he intended. The law, not the rope. Akiko nodded slowly, absorbing it. For the first time, she realized these soldiers were following orders just as she once had. Duty looked different in another language, but it felt the same underneath. By afternoon, Tanaka moved hut to hut, explaining procedures, translating menus, and even showing how to loosen the ropes for comfort. The guards watched him work, silent, respectful. When he paused to rest, Miller muttered, "He speaks both sides of the war." From that day, fear in the camp thinned. The ropes didn't vanish, but the hatred behind them began to fade. Akiko even caught herself helping another woman adjust her tag, this time without trembling. That night, as cicadas screamed outside, Tanaka passed by the women's barracks. He nodded once to Akiko, then disappeared into the dark. His words still echoed in her head. "It's the law, not the rope." And as quiet returned, another silence rose, the kind that hides unspoken stories and letters waiting to be written. After Tanaka's visit, something shifted in the rhythm of the camp. The fear no longer screamed, it whispered. The women had been allowed to write letters home, 1 page each, censored by the Americans, inspected before sealing. For the first time in months, Akiko held a pencil instead of a bandage. Her hand trembled as if it had forgotten the shape of words. She began simply, "Mother, I am alive," then stopped. What could she possibly write after that? That she wore a rope around her neck as a badge of survival. That the enemy gave her soap and food. The rules forbade details about conditions, locations, or officers. Every personal sentence felt like a secret she wasn't allowed to tell. So she wrote in code only her mother might understand, "The sky is hot, but the rice is white again." Reports indicate that more than 90% of Japanese POW letters during the war were censored or destroyed before reaching home. Words considered dishonorable were blacked out by U.S. intelligence censors. The Japanese government, in turn, often refused to acknowledge that its soldiers, especially women, were prisoners at all. Their silence was policy. Across the barracks others wrote too. Some letters were apologies, some were prayers. One woman simply drew the rope itself, a loop and a tag, with the words "proof of life." When Tanaka came to collect the envelopes, he looked at them a moment longer than protocol allowed. "I can't promise they'll reach Japan," he said quietly, "but you wrote them. That matters." Akiko tucked her letter into her rope cord that night, pressing the paper against her collarbone. It felt like wearing her past close enough to breathe. She whispered, "If it never leaves this camp, at least it leaves me." The sound of typewriters echoed from the administrative hut, where censors worked late. Keys clacked like distant gunfire. Each strike erased or rewrote a fragment of someone's truth. The next morning, only half the letters were returned for mailing. The rest gone. Akiko touched her rope, feeling the letter beneath her uniform. The cord, once a mark of shame, was now a hiding place for words too human for war. And by the time the next rainstorm hit, that rope would take on another meaning entirely. The rain came without warning, sheets of water drumming the tin roofs until voices drowned in the downpour. Inside the barracks, the women huddled close, ropes slick against their skin. The storm blurred the edges of everything, but not what the rope had become. Days had passed since the letter writing. Those who'd hidden their pages beneath their cords still touched them in secret, like small talismans. Akiko had stopped flinching at the feel of hemp. Somewhere between the panic and the waiting, the rope had changed. It wasn't a leash anymore, it was proof of existence. Every prisoner wore it, every morning checked it, every evening adjusted the knot before sleep. A small ritual, born out of humiliation, had turned into quiet defiance. Once we feared it. One woman whispered as she helped another tighten her tag. Now we fear losing it. That line spread through the camp like a hymn. Reports indicate that by late 1945, identification ropes in Allied camps were gradually replaced with printed metal tags. But not here. Supplies were limited and habits stuck. In Luzon, the rope had become a living artifact. When the Americans offered to switch them to tin tags, the women hesitated. They'd rather keep the coarse, ugly cords that had witnessed their survival. Akiko found herself retying hers carefully every morning, smoothing the fibers the way she once straightened a patient's bandages. The rope now carried every day she had endured, every order misunderstood, every letter censored, every fear survived. She caught herself thinking, if this rope breaks, what's left of me? Even the guards noticed the shift. The women no longer avoided eye contact. They moved with a strange dignity, ropes swaying with each step. It's like they own it now, one soldier remarked. Miller nodded. Guess symbols don't always mean what you want them to. At dusk, Akiko sat near the fence, staring at her reflection in a puddle. The tag swung gently against her throat, glinting under lightning flashes. For a moment, she imagined it wasn't a prisoner's mark but a medal, one she never asked for, yet earned. Then a gust of wind tore through the camp, snapping one woman's cord clean in half. The sound was small but sharp, a symbol unraveling. Akiko stood quickly, heart pounding. Tomorrow, that broken rope would test everything they'd redefined. The storm didn't stop for 2 days. Rain poured through the cracks in the bamboo roof, soaking the floor until it turned into mud. The women sat wrapped in wet blankets, trying to stay warm. In the dim light, Akiko saw it, one rope dangling from a woman's neck, shredded to thin threads. The tag hung loose, half buried in dirt. Without hesitation, Akiko crawled over. Don't lose it, she said softly. The woman looked down, her face pale. It broke in the night. Akiko took the cord gently in her hands. The fibers were swollen and soft from rain, impossible to re-knot. She glanced at her own uniform, sleeves torn, fabric frayed at the edges. With a surgeon's precision, she ripped a strip from her cuff and began weaving it into the rope, threading it through the soaked hemp until it held again. Outside, thunder rolled like artillery. The guards shouted for everyone to stay inside. In some camps during the Pacific War, reports indicate that monsoon conditions killed more prisoners through disease and exposure than combat ever did. Fever spread faster than bullets. In Luzon, the storm became its own kind of siege. Akiko worked quietly, fingers numb. The woman whispered, "Why fix it? We could pretend it's gone." Akiko shook her head, "Because it's ours now." The others watched in silence as she tied the final knot. When it held, the woman exhaled a fragile relief that felt bigger than survival. The rope wasn't perfect. It was patchwork, like all of them. By morning, the sky cleared into blinding sunlight. Mud steamed. The guards trudged through puddles, checking the barracks. Everything smelled of wet wood and smoke. Akiko stepped outside, the repaired rope drying against her skin. She looked around. Every woman was doing the same, retying, fixing, protecting the cords that had once shamed them. Then came the distant rumble of engines, not thunder this time, but trucks. The guards lined up at the gate, rifles slung low. One shouted to Miller, "Command convoy inbound." The prisoners exchanged glances. Change always began with the sound of engines. Akiko touched her rope again, unsure if it was the last time she'd wear it. The trucks drew closer, sunlight flashing off their windshields. Liberation was on the move, but no one dared believe it yet. The sound of those trucks carried across the valley like an approaching storm, but this one brought no fear. The gates of the bamboo camp creaked open as a column of jeeps and transport vehicles rolled in under the blazing Luzon sun. An American officer stepped out, his uniform crisp despite the mud. His words came through the interpreter, calm but unreal. "The war is over. You're free." For a few seconds, no one moved. The sentence didn't land. It just floated above them, heavy, unbelievable. Then the interpreter repeated it. "Japan has surrendered. You are going home." Reports from August of 1945 confirm that over 140,000 prisoners of war across all Allied territories were released following Japan's surrender. But for these 12 women, liberation felt weightless, almost hollow. After months of captivity, the fences were open, yet their bodies didn't know how to move beyond them. Some women wept, others just stared. Akiko reached for the rope around her neck. Her fingers hesitated before untying it. The cord had darkened with sweat and storm water, its fibers stiff and familiar. When she finally loosened it, the skin beneath was pale, shaped perfectly to its curve, a ghost of its presence. She didn't throw it away. None of them did. Each woman held the rope like a relic, coiled in her palm. To the guards, it was just an identification cord. To them, it had become memory itself, proof of humiliation survived, dignity rebuilt. An American medic offered Akiko a clean towel. She bowed slightly, then turned to the interpreter. "What will happen to this camp?" He shrugged. "We leave it behind, like everything else." The women were escorted to trucks, carrying bundles of clothes, letters, and small keepsakes. Akiko sat by the window, watching the bamboo huts fade into dust. She thought of the nights of rain, of soap and soup, of misunderstanding turned to humanity. Freedom felt heavier than the rope she'd just taken off. As the convoy snaked down the dirt road, the rope in her hands absorbed the last of the camp's dust. She whispered to it not goodbye, just thank you. In Tokyo years later, that same rope would reappear behind glass, its story rewritten for those who never felt its weight. Decades later, the rope sat under glass, frayed, faded, still looped exactly as it had been tied around Akiko's neck. The tag, a small rectangle of tin wired to the end, bore faint English letters. POW 147. Visitors at the Tokyo War Memory Museum leaned close, whispering. Most assumed it was evidence of Allied cruelty, another relic of defeat. But the small card beside it told a different story. Identification cord issued in Luzon, 1945, symbol of survival. The curator, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, guided schoolchildren through the exhibit. He stopped before the rope, gesturing gently. "People misunderstand this," he said. "It was not an instrument of punishment. It was an order, harsh, yes, but it kept them alive." His voice carried the reverence of someone explaining a ghost. The glass reflected a black and white photograph of the 12 women standing together in the camp, their rope tags visible like medals. Only 7 of those faces were ever identified after repatriation. Akiko's among them. The records said she returned to Yokohama in late 1946, worked as a midwife, and never spoke publicly about her imprisonment. But her letter, the one hidden in her rope, was found years later when she passed away. The paper was fragile, almost dust, yet the words were still legible. "This rope is not shame. It is proof that I lived." The curator folded his hands behind his back, eyes on the artifact. "They wore the rope because someone ordered it," he said quietly, "but they kept it because they chose to." Outside, rain tapped against the museum windows, soft as memory. Visitors moved on to the next exhibit, uniforms, helmets, fragments of history. Yet that rope lingered in the mind longer than any weapon. It wasn't made for honor or for horror. It existed somewhere in between, where rules meet mercy and survival reshapes meaning. In the final display light, the rope's shadow stretched across the glass, thin but unbroken. It looked less like a noose now and more like a line, the fragile boundary between surrender and dignity. Somewhere in that silence, Akiko's whispered truth seemed to echo again. It was never punishment. It was proof we lived.